everyone. Welcome back to the Don Lemon Show. My next guest needs no introduction, so why am I introducing him? Because I want you to remember who he is. James Comey. He's an attorney and he's a former director of the FBI. He's also an author now. His new book is called Westport. It's out right now. Thank you for joining us, James. We appreciate it.
Great to be with you, Don.
So I would imagine, considering what's going on in the world, what's happening in Manhattan, not far from where we are right now, that you are saying, my goodness, I'm so happy I'm not in this mess right now.
Yeah, there's a lot of that feeling, but also wish our country wasn't either. I had hoped that Donald Trump would be in his bathrobe, retired in Mar-a-Lago by this point.
Yeah. So, what you got? Any predictions for us? The outcome?
Yeah. Look, the usual caveats. I've tried a lot of cases, and unless you've been in the courtroom every moment, it's dangerous to predict, but I'll give you one. I think there's a very high likelihood of conviction. I'd say probably 80%, 20% chance of a hung jury, close to 0 or 0% chance of an acquittal.
Can you elaborate? Why do you think that? Give me those percentages? Why do you think?
Because the prosecution has built a case that frankly is stronger than I expected, having just read the indictment months ago, that is powerful in its immunity from cross-examination. They've built a document case, a case built based on the defendant's own words, reasonable logical inferences from those uncross-examinable documents. And then they capped it off with a cooperating witness who was already by that point heavily corroborated. So it's hard for me to see a circumstance in which 12 jurors would find the government hasn't met its burden. There's always a chance that a juror will say, or two will say, it doesn't quite get there. That's why I said the 20% chance of a hung jury.
Have you seen anything in the testimony? Because, Michael Cohen's on the stand and they said, well, last time he was on the stand on Friday, the defense, got some jabs in. Do you agree with that? Have you seen anything that makes you think that the prosecution is somehow dinged?
No. And I get why reporters would sit through hours of cross and then pick up the one thing they think was a stumble or a score, but that's not how a trial plays out for a jury. They've seen all the evidence and now they're taking this in as a whole. There's no criminal, and this is a cooperating witness, he's a criminal. There's no criminal who doesn't make statements that are susceptible to attack. That's what happens when you put a cooperating witness on the stand. It's the problem with prosecuting criminals. They tend to hang out with other criminals, so you don't get to put on a rabbi as your witness. But nothing I've seen so far makes me worry that the jury doesn't see how the evidence matches up. I once had a mob defendant explain corroboration as, I think it's when the evidence crosses over. Yeah, he was right. It is when the evidence crosses over, and there's been all kinds of crossing over in this case to form a pretty tight braid.
So nothing, you think that Michael's testimony, even though he is, as you said, a criminal, you think that it's been credible at this point?
I think so. But again, what's important is what came before. If the case were based on the testimony of a cooperating witness, there'd be all kinds of doubt. But when documents have come in, when the record has been made in such a way that they almost could have avoided calling Cohen, as best I can tell, then they're in a pretty good place.
Oh, I'm glad you said that, because I wonder if you think, I think the prosecution maybe thought, or people think that the prosecution's decision is to put Michael Cohen on. They weren't so sure about it, that this case was going to hinge on his testimony, given his criminal record and history of lying. That's not a concern for you.
That's always a concern when you put on a cooperator. And I'll bet they weighed whether to do the unexpected thing from the beginning, and that is not put on their main cooperator. But I think they probably said, look, the jury's going to look to hear from him. They'll dump all over this guy, but it kind of reminds you of that schoolyard taunt. I'm rubber, you're glue. I mean, Michael Cohen was Donald Trump's guy for years and years, so you can dump on him, but it kind of lands on the defense table a little. Yeah. So I'm guessing they wrestled with that. They said, we've strongly corroborated the case. Cohen's going to be okay. We'll put him on because the jury will expect it.
Do you think Trump will testify?
I don't know. It'd be fascinating to be inside that room. I'm sure he's talking like he wants to, but I doubt he will testify. He's a narcissist, but he's got enough life experience to know the danger that puts him in.
How long do you expect deliberations to last?
Impossible to tell.
Okay.
Because again, I've tried a lot of jury cases. You can't tell. Sometimes it's a door slammer. They all go back there, look at each other and say, yeah, this is done. And I had a jury one time return a verdict in 7 minutes. But I've had cases that I thought were very strong take days and days. There's no way to tell.
Before I move along, is there anything else significant that stands out to you? Any other takeaways from this trial?
I'm so glad the American people appear to be, at least a big portion of them, paying attention, because
Finally,
this
they
is about
were.
the rule of law. This is what it looks like,
Yeah.
right? You can shoot somebody in the middle of Fifth Avenue, and maybe you won't lose supporters, but you will be held accountable. And this is what accountability looks like. And I think it's a great civics lesson for the American people, not just in the showing that no one is above the law, but showing this is how the law works.
Mm-hmm. This is there's a poll that I wanted to, since you went there. There's a recent Yahoo YouGov poll that found that Americans that now approve of Trump indictment and trial has gone up to 42%, James, in March to 42% in March to 49% now in May. Despite the political smoke, it seems that Americans are increasingly viewing this trial as legitimate. They're also paying attention more.
I think that's great. I mean, that is a very real sense that a civics lesson is taking hold. People love courtroom dramas. It's one of the reasons I now make a living writing some of them, but they're paying attention, and I'm sure learning from it, and their confidence will grow because they see how regular it is.
Yeah.
The defendant sits at one table, the prosecution at the other, the judge protects the jury, makes sure that each side is playing fair. This is the way it happens every single day, no matter who the defendant is. It's not perfect. We have an imperfect justice system, but watching it gives you confidence that we're doing a pretty good job.
Yeah. That same poll discovered that while many Americans believe that Trump falsified those business records that you talked about, this is a documents case, right? That there shouldn't be any criminal repercussions for him. What do you make of that?
Yeah, I don't know what to make of that. People often don't know what to do in terms of sentencing. Some states still have jury sentencing. Most have gone to judges because they're expert. I wouldn't expect the American people to think in terms of, so how many cases have there been like this? Who got what punishment? Those are things that a judge has to know.
Yeah. All right. So let's move on a little bit. It's still related to the trial, but not about the specific testimony, because you've seen this. And you know how this has been politicized. Obviously, you know what happened in 2016. You're well aware of this. The far right House of Representative members showed up outside the Manhattan Courthouse. They did it last week. They want to protest this ongoing hush money trial against the former president, including, let's see, it was Matt Gaetz of Florida, Lauren Boebert of Colorado, Bob Good of Virginia. I think Vivek Ramaswamy was out there. He's not a member of Congress, but he was out there, and a number of other people. This display of support for Trump risks Republicans ceding their control over the House floor on Thursday. I mean, you're no stranger to this, all this politicizing, all of this stuff. What do you make of this stunt held by these hard right supporters?
It's hard to make sense of it. And I did mob cases, and the mafia in the United States has long had a practice of bringing people to court in an effort to rattle a witness. Mm-hmm. Famously, in The Godfather 2, Michael Corleone brought Frankie Pentangeli's brother to try and upset him while he testified. I assume that's not why you're bringing Lauren Boebert into court. I don't think that's making a big difference. I assume it's an effort to get around the gag order or to show some sort of loyalty in the cult of Donald Trump. To my mind, all it does is signal that the Republican Party really doesn't exist anymore.
Do you think it'll have any influence over the jury, or they're not? Or you think they're even aware? I know they say don't watch the news or what have you, but I think they probably do.
Yeah, I doubt that having Lauren Boebert or J.D. Vance criticizing the prosecution, even if it reached the jurors, is going to make a difference, which is why I look at this and just shrug and say, what a sad place the Republican Party's in. That's about it.
But you know what it is? I think it's an opportunity for them to spread more of this rhetoric, because Trump is still under a gag order and he has to keep quiet. But perhaps this is a way for them to defy that gag order and not have the former president face any repercussions.
Yeah, maybe. And maybe technically that it's a violation of the gag order to do indirectly what you can't do directly. But I think we see some wisdom on the part of the prosecution and the judge just ignoring it because it's just noise.
You said that you thought you're surprised. I don't want to misquote you here. I'm paraphrasing. You were surprised that the prosecution put on such a good case, right? Do I have your sentiments?
It was stronger than I expected.
Stronger than you expected. While we mentioned Vivek Ramaswamy, he is or Vivek, like cake, I think is what he says it is. He calls it a political sham. So obviously, if you think that it's stronger than you thought, then you don't think it's a political sham, do you?
No, this is what a criminal trial looks like. And again, maybe it'll end in a hung jury. Maybe I'll be wrong. It'll end in an acquittal. But this is how it works. The government has the burden of proof. They present their evidence. The defendant gets to cross-examine. The defendant can't speak whenever he wants, can't talk whenever he wants to, can't get up in court and make speeches. People have to tell the truth when they're in a court of law. It's so different than political discourse that it's foreign to a lot of people. And I suspect it's not foreign to those showing up in their red ties and white shirts outside. They just don't want the American people to pay attention. In the poll, the good news is the poll you read to me sounds like people are paying attention, which is great.
Yeah, in the beginning, I was concerned because people weren't really watching it on television. They weren't really, I mean, en masse. Obviously, it's not like O.J. Simpson because there are no cameras in the courtroom. But at first, there was a concern that people weren't paying attention. But I think as we get closer to a verdict and closer to the election as well, I think people are starting to pay attention. Listen, you mentioned the red ties and the suits like Donald Trump. It goes beyond that, and people just sort of, political rhetoric outside of the courtroom. There is this looming threat of election violence in a lot of people's minds in this coming election cycle. Republican senatorial candidate Carrie Lake of Arizona suggested, and I quote here, "Strap on a Glock this election season." Tom Cotton is posting on X to, quote, "take matters in their own hands," telling people take matters into their own hands when dealing with the Gaza protesters on college campuses. So not to mention the string of violence that occurred on January 6th. So from the perspective of the former head of the FBI, what is your read on the threat of election-related violence this upcoming November, or even just before November?
We're going to see what we've seen for the last couple of years. First, a dramatic rise in the number of threats aimed at public servants, elected officials, election workers. We're going to see at the margins some disturbed people engage in acts of violence. All of that is terrible, and I feel badly for those people who are threatened, those who are victims of violence. But I don't believe we're going to see, and I think they're paper tigers in this way, we're not going to see large-scale mob organized violence. I think what the Justice Department has done since January 6th has frankly scared the crap out of a lot of these people. And Trump's followers are not jihadis looking to lay down their lives for the orange god. They are people with jobs and families who are deterrable. And they have deterred the daylights out of them since January the 6th by prosecuting more than 1,000 and still hunting them to send a message, never again. And so I'm not worried, believe it or not, about the large scale violence. And it's a good sign. Who do you see outside the Trump courthouse today? I mean, some guy with penis balloons or something. Where are the mobs? They've stayed away because they're frightened of what the justice system will do to them. And that's a good thing.
You think so? I mean, even with this, Trump's whole "I'm being persecuted," even with all, you don't think he's pouring gasoline on the MAGA movement fire?
He is, but what the fire will do is burn hot in very narrow places. So I don't want to downplay that. People are going to get hurt. People are going to be threatened. People may be killed. That's an awful thing. At the same time, I don't believe he has the ability to motivate large groups of people to violence like we saw on January the 6th, because a lesson was learned from that there will be severe consequences. And this is not a crowd that's about severe consequences. There are a lot of barking, a lot of shouting, a lot of threatening. But the government's going to have to be prepared, obviously, at the next inauguration, which God willing will be Joe Biden's. But I really don't think that the MAGA movement has it in it any longer to engage in that large scale organized violence.
Interesting. So even after the election, if it doesn't go Donald Trump's way, you believe that the Justice Department has done enough to deter those kinds of acts?
Well, I've seen, look, at the margins, you have people like the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys, where long jail sentences have been sent. That's a shockwave of deterrence. But in the main, you have troubled people drawn to violence in a crowd on that day, and it's terrible and inexcusable, and they all needed to be prosecuted. But I've talked to enough people in the FBI, enough federal prosecutors about the reaction of most of these defendants, and it's wrecked their lives, which is good, because that word will ricochet around the country and it changes behavior.
Do you think election denialism is here to stay?
Yeah, it'll ebb and flow. Sure, it's here to stay because it's useful to a lot of public figures to motivate their base, but they'll have to find other ways to motivate because they'll have squeezed that lemon so hard that it's not going to give them any more juice after a while.
No pun intended.
Sorry about the lemon. I'm going with orange then. You squeeze that orange.
It's interesting that you said what you said because, in 2016, you could have never said, hopefully, God willing, that it'll be Joe Biden, right? So you're saying who you would hope to be the next president. You couldn't do that when you were FBI director.
Oh, no. And I didn't even vote and tried very hard not to pay attention to the political arguments that were going on. And we were unfortunately thrust into it, which is a nightmare that will never go away. But yeah, I couldn't be part of the political process. It's why I tried to stay so far away from Donald Trump once he was elected.
Mm-hmm.
You can't be as FBI director on anybody's team. Look, I'm almost 8 years out. I'm a private citizen. I believe most of all in the rule of law in this country. I think that's the thing that knits us together. We can disagree about all kinds of really important policy issues,
Mm-hmm.
but we ought to have a common view of the rule of law. We have to have it or we don't have a country. So that's why this election matters so much. Nobody can afford to be a low information voter here.
Mm-hmm.
People need to watch videos of January 6th, listen to the voices of Trump's former cabinet members saying that guy should never be near the Oval Office, and realize you wouldn't hire a plumber with those reviews. So you need to participate and vote, all of us, me included.
Yeah. Let me just remind folks, given your last answer there, your reign as the FBI director fell during, what you can argue was the beginning of this political era in 2017. Perhaps it started back with the Tea Party, what have you. But I mean, the main thrust of it happened during when Trump ran for president. In 2017, you were fired from your position as the FBI director by Donald Trump, President Trump. Many people speculated that this decision was made to hamper your investigation into Russian interference in the 2016 election. So you've had plenty of dealings with the former president. What is your biggest fear if he wins come November?
That he will be smarter and more determined and surrounded by even worse people than the last time. And there were some bad people, but even those bad people want no part of it. So we're going another few inches closer to the bottom of the barrel.
The last time was a dress rehearsal, you believe?
I do think it's a dress rehearsal. I mean, believe your ears when Donald Trump tells you this, I'll be the retribution president. He's going to try to burn it all down. And I realize a lot of people think, oh, it's entertaining. I'd like to see someone take on the elites. This isn't about that. This is about what are we as a country, and do we maintain a constitution and a rule of law? That's what this is about.
Yeah, and it's really a threat to American democracy. So let's talk about Project 2025. You're familiar, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
This policy proposal intended to lay out a plan for Trump's second term. Stephen Miller, Mark Meadows involved in this, Charlie Kirk, all of them contributed to this Project 2025. Many of its suggested policies are overly Christian nationalist. They want to, get rid of the FBI, the Department of Justice, and so on and so forth. Having known many of these people, are you surprised at all of this extreme list of policy suggestions?
No, because even down the bottom of the barrel, there are some people who are far smarter than Donald Trump, and their objectives are twisted, but they have a sense for how they might accomplish them in a way they didn't in the first term. And so, among other things, they're going to aim at the apolitical, non-political middle level in the Department of Justice, in the Department of Defense, and all those other places. Because those people, there's no deep state, but there's a deep culture of serving the American people without regard to politics in those middle levels. And so they're going to try and aim at those, the ballast that keeps us steady, and see if by hijacking that middle layer, they can't bend these institutions to their will.
As I said, he wants to dismantle the FBI. That's the proposals. That's one of the proposals in Project 2025. He wants to use the Insurrection Act of 1807 to activate the military for domestic law enforcement, as well as directing the DOJ to target Trump adversaries. I don't know if you think that they can actually do this, but as a former head of the FBI, I mean, what do you think of his suggestion to dismantle it? And do you think they would actually be able to achieve any of these things if they?
Most of it is just ways to BS their followers. They were going to tear down the deep state.
Can't happen.
Okay, dismantle the FBI. Who does that job? Because somebody needs to protect America from terrorists, from kidnappers, from sexual exploiters of children. So someone has to do that work. I worry more about their efforts to try and use the system to target particular people. And there's a reasonable chance they could start that effort and go after people they see as their enemies. the saving grace for all of us again will be actually the part of our national system that has passed its stress test in the last 5 years, and that's our court system.
Yeah.
The court system is a place where it doesn't matter what you say outside of Four Seasons Total Landscaping with mascara running down your face. You have to bring evidence, facts, and the truth into court, or there will be severe consequences. That's ultimately our saving grace. That if you want to target your enemies, fine, but you have to bring evidence into court and prove something beyond a reasonable doubt, or people are going to lose their ability to practice law, to make a living, and that's a good place to be for our country.
I remember, and I don't know if you remember that I got a lot of flack for really sort of parroting what Christopher Wray had said as a head of the FBI, talking about. But this was during talking about the Muslim ban, right? And he said that the greatest terror threat to the United States was domestic terrorism, not foreign terrorism, and that was carried out most part by the far right, and usually, white guys who radicalize to the right. Why do people become so upset about that when he, as the FBI director, is telling the truth?
Because one of our political parties has become white identity violence adjacent.
So, Director, I'm curious to know what you think about the Georgia case. Do you think it has any teeth? It probably will not go to trial before the election, if at all. If he becomes president, then maybe this goes away. I'm not sure. But do you think this case has any teeth, in your opinion?
I don't know. I don't think any of the three remaining cases, the state election case in Georgia, the federal election case in DC, or the federal classified documents case in Florida, will go to trial before the election. I can't tell in the Fulton County case. There are things that confuse me about it. I don't understand why people get to plead guilty in that case, issue a letter of apology, and then the guilty conviction will be wiped away over time. I don't get a lot of it. So I probably shouldn't criticize it because I don't know their procedure well. I know the federal system much better, but I don't think it matters because none of the three are going to be tried before the election.
I wonder if you were sitting watching, I'm sure you were, watching Fani Willis and her testifying, and the whole idea that it was a conflict of interest for her to have this relationship with a coworker. What did you think of that?
I don't understand the procedure that allows the defendant why there would be a hearing on such a thing. At least in the system I know, it would be an ethics issue for the administration to handle, maybe for the bar to handle. I don't get how a defendant gets to try and use that. At the same time, I was appalled by the judgment involved in someone having a relationship with one of their underlings in a case like that. I just don't get it. But again, I'm on the outside, so I don't want to throw rocks.
Yeah. And the presidential immunity case, you said you don't see it going before any of the cases. You said the three remaining cases. But I mean, do you find it odd that the Supreme Court is actually considering presidential immunity?
I do and I don't. And I think this is really important that folks realize this. The court is going to quickly backhand the claim that Trump advanced that he has absolute immunity from prosecution for anything after leaving office. But they have to answer a much harder question, which is, so is there any immunity? And what would it look like? What would the standard be? Because if Joe Biden loses this election to Donald Trump, what immunity he has is going to be very important. And so the court is going to try to answer that question. And Jack Smith's lawyer arguing the case basically agreed with that, said that the Court of Appeals below was wrong to say simply there is no presidential immunity, because if you think about it, there has to be some. And so the court, I think, has taken the time. They're going to wipe away Trump's claim, but then say, but there is a small zone of immunity, and here's how it's defined, which I think we would all want. I think we all want that.
When I look back at this, time, or I look back at 2016 and then to now, I feel like, man, nothing has changed. The same things that were sort of trending then are trending now, right? You had Stormy Daniels, you had, Donald Trump. At one point, Hillary Clinton was speaking out about Donald Trump and what was happening down in the courtroom. I was like, man, I think we've gone back to the future with this. You had the Hillary Clinton email scandal, arguably that, and your investigation into Russian collusion that helped to really shape the course of two different elections. When you reflect on that period, what stands out to you?
Well, a lot of it does feel the same, as you said to me, and I think that makes sense because the demagogue is still center stage. The kind of figure our founders feared most is still in the middle of the action. And there's an argument that these criminal cases have allowed him to stay there in an unusual way. When I when I think back to 16 and 17, look, it was a nightmare at the time. I hated that the FBI had any contact
Mhm.
with anything related to an election, but we were in the middle of it, and so we had to make a call. And both doors that we were facing led to hell, and so we tried to pick the one that was the most principled and made the most sense in light of what our institution was. So I hated it then. I knew I would hate it years down the road, and I was right.
Yes, and you have moved on, and I'm going to move on in a second, but I just have to ask you one or two more things as it relates to this. Looking back, right, I wonder if you have any regrets as to the way you handle those investigations. And then the second part of that question is, what advice, knowing what you know now, what advice would you give the people who are in charge, who are handling these upcoming investigations? One, regrets; two, advice.
I have a number of small regrets that aren't worth your time, but things that I think I blew when I look back. But in the main, the decisions that people know about, I still feel good about them. Not good in that I had to make them, but we made them for the right reasons. We were not trying to help Donald Trump or hurt Hillary Clinton or the reverse. As I said, at the time, I knew how bad this was for us, but I'm proud of the way we made the decision. And so my advice for people stuck in the middle is realize that you're in those leadership roles for a reason. So do the right thing for the right reason. And then you'll be able to look in the mirror every morning, no matter how painful it is that you were involved. And remember that when you're faced with extraordinary times, think about the values of the institution. Make a decision that you could explain to sixth graders a decade from now
Mhm.
with pride, and you'll be okay.
This is this is behind you, right? Because you have two books. You have one that you wrote a while ago, and this is the sequel to that. I'm just wondering if when you're speaking to people like me, if you're like, Don, stop asking me these questions. I've moved along. I've moved on. Can we talk about something else? Can we talk about what I'm doing now in the future? Do you get tired of answering these questions?
I mean, yes and no. Sure, because I've talked about it a million times, but no, because I get why it matters to
You get it.
people, right?
Good.
People can't be with us in those rooms in 2016. I'm in this weird place where my, thank goodness, my public identity is fading. People now just think they went to high school with me or something. But when people yell F you at me on the streets, I have to pause and say, so is that a left wing
Uh,
F you or a right wing F you? Because the
wow.
FBI found itself in the middle. That's not a bad place to be, although I'd like not to get cursed out on the street. And so I'm of two minds on it.
Yeah. So as I said, you've moved on, and I think I find it very interesting that you have sort of, you're doing something completely different. You're an author now. You have this new book out. It's called Westport. It is a crime novel. As I said, it's a sequel to your first fiction book called Central Park West. How have you found this transition from, real life lawmen to crafting, fictional ones?
Much better and frankly addictive in a way that I had not expected. I had to kind of
Really?
be pushed into this. I wrote a nonfiction book that did very well after I was fired, and my editors started pushing me to write fiction. They kept calling parts of the book this scene and that scene, and I kept saying, dude, it's not a scene, it's my life. And they would say, yeah,
Mhm.
but you write narrative well, you write dialogue well, you really could make up stories and tell them. And I would say, no, I'm not in the make up stories business. But when I tried it, I found it a ton of fun, both because it's a little bit of memory lane for me, although they're in modern day. But I get to show people the inside of places that they can't see through fiction, which is freeing in a way, harder than nonfiction in some ways, but freeing in a way. So I can take them inside the FBI, inside the Justice Department, in this book, inside a huge hedge fund where I once worked at such a place. And I have a lot of fun doing it. And my whole family's involved. My wife is my editor in chief, and my 5 kids all give me brutal but loving feedback. So that makes it fun for me too.
Could you have written this without the experience that you had, especially during 2016 and 2017? Could you have written these books?
Probably not. I mean, I've stayed away from DC based. We'll get there eventually, but it's still too raw. And I'd like Donald Trump to leave our national scene before I write stories that are centered at the White House or the CIA or the FBI. I think I couldn't have written these books without the life experience in total. So I wouldn't say 16 and 17 were key ingredients. They were just part of the whole wild journey.
Well, I just wonder if it was you wanted to get so far away from it,
Well,
right?
it's
That it was cathartic in a way. It's like, you know what, I'm just going to do something completely different, and I'm going to use this to push me in that direction. So, was it a catharsis to be able to do this?
Yeah, maybe. I try to do a lot of different things. The year after I was fired, I taught at Howard University, which was a really cool experience for me. I don't know how much they got out of me, but I learned a lot. And so I've done a variety of things like that since. And I've always loved to write. I mean, thought I would be a journalist when I was in college. So I've always loved writing. And so maybe it was natural to get back because of that experience and because of what you said, that it was something in a totally different space.
What is the biggest mistake you think that most crime film and TV books make when it comes to how they present criminal investigations?
I think a lot of folks don't know how great a story can be while also being real. I mean, the work is really exciting. And so you don't need to make stuff up, right? Investigators and prosecutors don't need to go rogue in some huge way to make it interesting. It's pretty gripping stuff when you've been on the inside and can tell real stories, but fictionalized. And so I get why people exaggerate and make stuff up because maybe they don't know the inside in a good way. That's what I hope I bring to readers is I'll show you what it's really like, and you'll have a hard time putting it down from your beach chair because it's exciting on the inside.
Oh, well, I can't wait to read it. I need something to read other than, what is happening in the news, because honestly, I think you're a great writer, but you cannot write the, what that is.
No, and
That has
editors
been
would reject
happening.
it as too fanciful. If you tried to write about a porn star hush money case by they'd say, no, stop, write something closer to
Yeah.
reality. And so I
Yeah,
hope
that would never happen. Yeah, right.
because there's no Donald Trump in my books. I hope that it will be a good cleanser that will give you a lot of fun in a whodunit this summer.
The biggest challenges, you mentioned some of it. You said, how your editors push you. The biggest challenges when it comes to pivoting to fiction writing.
Biggest challenge is keeping your characters on track. That is, there's a tendency for characters to drift and to sort of start to sound like each other. And so remember, because these people aren't real, so remembering them in a real way in your head and staying true to them is hard. And that's where my wife helps me a tremendous amount. She'll read it. Our protagonist is a woman who's a prosecutor who's based on my daughters, especially my oldest, who's a federal prosecutor. And so my wife will read it and say, Nora's starting to sound a little bit like this or like that. You got to get it back on track. That's the hardest part.
What's next for you?
The first book did well enough that I think this is my job now, which I love. And so my wife is my story imaginer. So we can picture another 6 to 9 books. So I'm going to try to do one of these a year. And then I'm now a grandfather that the big part of my time is watching the little ones. And so those two things should keep me busy. I know they keep me happy.
Well, the book is called it's called Westport, and it is a sequel to your first fiction book called Central Park West. Anything we didn't cover, James Comey?
No, it was a great conversation. I'm really glad to have it with you.
Yeah. Thank you. I appreciate you joining us. I hope you'll come back maybe to talk more about what's happening, in the world, and to also talk about your books. Hopefully you'll write another one. Thank you for being with us. Okay.
Okay. Thanks, Don. Good luck.
Thank you. You as well. Thanks for watching The Don Lemon Show. Make sure you click on the image in the top right to subscribe to my channel and the thumbnail in the bottom right to watch more content from my show. And I'll see you next time.